That woman in the perfect charcoal suit. The one with the hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She stepped right up onto my porch, didn't ask a single question, just pointed at the lodge I'd spent 7 years building and declared, straight up, "You built this on our land." It wasn't a greeting, it was an eviction notice delivered with a designer handbag. And for a moment, I just stood there, coffee still steaming in the cold mountain air, looking at her like she was speaking a foreign language, because the deed in my pocket, the one that proved this land, this view, these stones, this Douglas fir railing I'd hand-planed myself, was mine, felt suddenly useless, like wet newspaper. My name is Caleb Vance. I'm 46, and I used to run a tight little climbing and guiding outfit down in the Rockies. But that was before Alara, before the accident. Alara and I, we weren't big city people. We dreamt of this quiet spot, this perfect 5 acres of high desert forest right near the Shadow Peak Range, a place where nobody could tell us how to live or what kind of life we were allowed to build. I bought the land 8 years ago from an old rancher named Silas Gray. Clean title, clear survey, miles from the nearest township, not a whisper of a homeowners association, because if there had been, I never would have touched it. This lodge, it wasn't just a house, you see. It was the last conversation I had with her, the final promise I had left to keep. I spent those 7 years alone, my hands perpetually stained with sap and plaster, living out of a canvas tent through 2 brutal winters just to get the foundation poured and the frame up. I didn't hire a crew because I needed every nail, every stone, every mistake fixed and learned, to have her memory baked right into the walls. The main support beams, I salvaged them from a dilapidated old trestle bridge, and the massive fieldstone fireplace inside? That rock came from a creek bed 3 miles west, lugged up here 100 pounds at a time. Every piece of this place had a history I could trace, a personal cost I'd paid, and when I finally hung the last door 2 years ago, I didn't feel happiness, not exactly, but I felt this deep, settling peace, like I had finally kept my word. That peace lasted until about a month ago. I was splitting cedar out back when a beat-up pickup belonging to Vern Hodges, a kind of grumpy, 70-something local carpenter who helped me with the truss work back in year 4, pulled up. He sat on the porch drinking a beer I handed him and just looked uneasy. Heard some chatter in town. "Caleb," he grumbled, wiping foam from his mustache. Something about folks trying to incorporate all the land on the North Ridge into some kind of community covenant, some kind of new HOA. I just laughed it off. You know, mountain people don't do HOAs. It's an urban myth, right? But 2 weeks later, the laughter died in my throat when this immaculate, obsidian black SUV, the kind that clearly costs more than my entire year's food budget, slowly crawled up the dusty track and stopped right in front of my porch. Out stepped 2 men in suits, clipboards in hand, and then her, Marcia Winslow, president of the newly formed Pinnacle Heights Conservancy. She was the one who delivered the line, "You built this on our land." I showed them my deed. I showed them my survey map, the one clearly stamped and notarized by Elias County, but the tall guy, the one who smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fear, just flipped open his board and slid a new map toward me. "Our updated boundary records, Mr. Vance," he said, and his tone made my stomach clench. "This property falls squarely within the Conservancy's jurisdiction, established back in 2018. The lines on their map didn't match mine. They cut a full 25 feet further south, right under the edge of my lodge. I told them it was impossible, told them there was no conservancy when I bought the land, but they just smiled thin, professional smiles and said they'd be sending the formal documentation soon. Then they spun around, got back into the black hearse, and left me standing there, holding a glossy business card that suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb. A week later, the thick, heavy envelope arrived. The demands hit me like a physical blow. Not only did the Conservancy claim my lodge, but they demanded retroactive fees totaling $55,000 for 5 years of unpaid dues. Below that was a list of architectural violations so petty it was ludicrous. My cedar roof pitch was too steep for community aesthetics, my exterior stain was the wrong hue, and my native landscaping, the one designed to blend seamlessly with the forest, did not conform to approved horticultural standards. But the punch to the gut came with the final paragraph. Fail to comply and pay within 30 days, and the Conservancy reserved the right to reclaim the property for common use. I tried everything. I called the title company, and the previously chirpy clerk suddenly sounded vague and nervous, talking about unusual claims and protracted investigation timelines. I drove into town to find Silas Gray, the old rancher, but his number was disconnected, and his mail wasn't being delivered. I was alone, trapped between my undeniable legal documents and this glossy, aggressive new corporation. So I drove to the Conservancy's headquarters, a ridiculous, newly renovated Main Street office that smelled of lemon polish and unearned power. I marched into Marcia Winslow's corner office, threw the letter onto her immaculate glass desk, and demanded proof. She didn't even blink. "Mr. Vance," she said, leaning back in her Italian leather chair. "Sometimes the county records are messy. We rely on historical documents." She pushed a different, older-looking map towards me, one she claimed traced ownership back to a 1940s land grant. The prior owner, Mr. Gray, was clearly misinformed about the precise boundaries when he sold to you. "It's an honest mistake." "Honest mistake?" I spat, trying to keep my voice low enough not to shatter the expensive-looking vase on her credenza. 7 years of my life, every cent of my savings, the last project I had with my wife. And you call it an honest mistake? This isn't about boundaries, Ms. Winslow. This is about what you want to erase. She just gave me that terrible, patronizing smile. "It's about conformance, Caleb. We'll allow you to keep the lodge, with some modifications, of course." And she slid a new list across. Change the roof color to slate gray. Lower the roof line 3 feet to fit the neighborhood profile. Rip out your native plants and install the 3 pre-approved species from our mountain cottage collection. The air felt thin. "You want me to gut its soul," I whispered, shaking my head. "You want to turn Alara's dream into a stucco nightmare." "I want you to join the community," she corrected, her voice ice cold. "You have 30 days. Don't wait too long to consult a lawyer." I walked out of there without another word, clutching the papers like they were cursed. But I knew one thing. This wasn't about community standards. This was personal, and it was escalating fast. Because as soon as I made it clear I wasn't going to surrender, they didn't send another letter. They launched a full-scale, coordinated assault from every corner of the county government. The first shot was from the Elias County Planning Department. A stop-use order. They claimed my lodge lacked the final occupancy permit, even though I was holding the notarized, signed document right in my hand. When I called, the administrative voice on the other end said the inspector listed on my paperwork was no longer with the department, and that their records showed no final inspection. They told me I couldn't occupy the house for 6 to 8 weeks while they scheduled a re-inspection. I drove home to find a bright red placard stapled to my front door. Occupancy prohibited. It was designed to shame me. 2 days later, the tax assessor's office chimed in. My property taxes had suddenly been reclassified from residential to commercial resort, increasing my bill by a stomach-turning 320%. $85,000 due in 60 days. I called, I argued, I pleaded, but the clerk just repeated, "It's in the system, Mr. Vance. Based on updated land use data. Pay first, appeal later. Refunds take a year." Then came the final piece. A zoning board summons for an alleged setback violation. They claimed my lodge was built 18 feet too close to the property line, violating code. I knew they were wrong. My foundation was 75 feet from the nearest boundary, well within the 50-foot requirement. But when I showed up at the hearing, the Conservancy's lawyer presented a third map, a new, corrected survey that magically shifted the property line 25 feet inward, putting my lodge squarely in the violation zone. I looked at the 3 men on the zoning board, their faces bored and distant, and realized none of them would even make eye contact with me. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a coordinated, high-level campaign designed to bury me in paperwork and fees until I either collapsed or sold the land for pennies. I went back to the lodge that night and spread every cursed piece of paper across the floor. The stop-use notice, the obscene tax bill, the zoning summons, the HOA's threat. I sat there in the firelight, watching Alara's framed photo on the mantel, feeling a fear I hadn't felt since she passed away. The fear of everything I had built being taken by an unseen, uncaring system. Maybe they're right, I whispered to her picture. Maybe I'm just one guy who thought he could escape the rules. But then the anger came, hot and necessary. This wasn't the system working. This was the system being weaponized. I refused to let that happen. My lifeline came, not through official channels, but through Vern Hodges, the old carpenter. He showed up one evening with a six-pack, a lukewarm pizza, and a dusty cardboard box. "Marcia Winslow," he said, taking a long drink. "She's a piece of work. Used to be a prosecutor. She knows how to push people. She did the same thing 20 years ago to old Miller's ranch. Buried him in permits till he sold for next to nothing." Then he opened the box and pulled out yellowed, brittle paper. "I worked survey crews in the 90s, Caleb. Just labor, but I remember the boundaries. They're trying to fake this." He unrolled an ancient survey map from 95, tracing a line with his calloused finger. "See this line? That's the old timber boundary. Your land is outside any of the planned developments. Way outside." "Why?" I asked, staring at the discrepancy. "Why this spot?" Vern looked me dead in the eye. "Because your land is worth a hell of a lot more than you paid for it. It's the perfect spot for what they call prime resort development. If they get it, Winslow or whoever is backing her, they make a fortune." The confirmation of the profit motive was chilling, but the worst blow landed the next morning. A sheriff's deputy showed up and handed me a thick packet, an order of possession. The Conservancy had filed suit and wanted default judgment because I had failed to appear at a hearing I never knew existed. I had 14 days to vacate. I spent the next 3 days living on coffee and adrenaline, poring over property law and civil procedure. I found the loophole. State law requires actual notice for property seizures, not just mailing a letter, but proof of receipt. They claimed they sent certified mail, but I had no signature, no delivery record, nothing. They had intentionally kept me in the dark so they could win by default. At 2 a.m., I hit send on an email to a Seattle-based property rights attorney named Dahlia Reyes. The subject line was short and desperate. "I need help. They're trying to steal my home." Dahlia Reyes arrived 2 days later, driving a dusty Subaru up my track like a seasoned local. She wasn't wearing a suit. She was wearing jeans, a blazer, and hiking boots. She took one look at my timeline and the order of possession and shook her head. "Caleb," she said, her voice sharp and focused. "This is textbook fraud. We're going to tear this case apart." The evidence stacked up faster than I could have imagined. First, the service was improper. "The burden of proof is on them to prove you were notified," Dahlia said, tapping the court record. "A certificate of mailing with no signature? That's not going to fly for property seizure." Second, the historical deed was a sham. Dahlia discovered the Conservancy claimed ownership based on a 1940s document, but the Pinnacle Heights Conservancy wasn't legally incorporated until 2018. They're claiming a 66-year-old property line for an organization that didn't exist yet, she said, raising an eyebrow. "Impossible." Third, the surveyor was suspended. Dahlia called the state board and found the licensed surveyor listed on the Conservancy's corrected map had his license suspended back in 2019 for fraudulent work. "That survey is officially worthless," she declared. Fourth, the map was digitally forged. Our digital forensics report showed the HOA's survey file, created in 2020, had been manually modified in 2024, just weeks before they first contacted me. Someone had opened it in image editing software and redrawn the boundaries. But the final, crushing blow came from their own financial records. When Dahlia filed a motion forcing disclosure, we found the Conservancy had taken a massive $700,000 development loan from a company called A-Frame Resort Group. And who was a silent partner and signatory on that loan? Marcia Winslow. "This isn't governance, Caleb," Dahlia said, sliding a printout of a leaked internal email across the table. "A list of priority acquisition targets, with my property at the top. This is real estate fraud. She wants your land to build a resort. The fees, the permits, the default judgment. It's all designed to force you to sell so she can cash in." The moment we had the evidence, Dahlia changed tactics. "We're going public," she said. We filed a comprehensive counterclaim, fraud, slander of title, abuse of process, and arranged a meeting with a regional investigative reporter. The story broke 2 days later. Local HOA uses fake maps and shady deals in land grab scheme. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People I didn't know formed a community group called Stand with Caleb, and anonymous tips poured into Dahlia's office. Other victims of Marcia Winslow's predatory tactics. The pressure shifted instantly, turning the hunters into the hunted. Marcia Winslow held a pathetic press conference, trying to look composed as she read a boilerplate denial. But when the reporter asked her about the unlicensed surveyor, she froze. When they asked about her financial ties to the resort group, she ended the conference abruptly and retreated inside, looking every bit the guilty party. The emergency hearing was set for 10 days out. The courtroom was packed, journalists, local residents, and the people from the Stand with Caleb group. Across the aisle, Marcia Winslow sat, rigid and flanked by 3 expensive, sweating lawyers. Dahlia was a force of nature, calm, methodical, and surgically precise. She first dismantled the default judgment, showing the court records that proved improper service. "They cannot seize private property, Your Honor," she stated, without proving the owner was given a meaningful chance to defend it. Then she called our expert surveyor to the stand, who projected the 3 different maps: mine, Vern's old 1995 map, and the Conservancy's forged map, onto the screen. "There is no ambiguity here, Your Honor," the expert testified. "The Conservancy's boundary is physically impossible, inconsistent with county GIS data, and was created by a surveyor who lacked a valid license." The air thickened when Dahlia called a surprise witness, Mr. Hayes, the former HOA treasurer, who had been granted immunity. He was shaking, but his words were clear. "Ms. Winslow told me to backdate meeting minutes. She told me to falsify financial disclosures. She said, no one ever checks this stuff. And if I refused, she'd have me replaced." He pointed directly at Winslow. "She ran the Conservancy like a criminal enterprise, all to make money on land deals." Finally, Dahlia presented the loan documents, the resort company ownership, and the priority target email. She looked at Judge Edison Flint, who was known for his lack of patience and sharp intellect. "Your Honor," she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, "this is not a case of community standards. This is systematic criminal fraud for private profit." The judge called a 10-minute recess, and the silence in the courtroom was absolute. When Judge Flint returned, he didn't mince words. He adjusted his glasses, looked directly at Marcia Winslow, and delivered his verdict in a calm, devastating tone. First, the default judgment is vacated. The right to due process was undeniably violated. Second, the emergency injunction is granted. All eviction proceedings are halted immediately. Third, the Pinnacle Heights Conservancy's claim of jurisdiction over Mr. Vance's property is dismissed with prejudice. He paused, then delivered the final, satisfying blow. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Elias County District Attorney for a full investigation into criminal fraud, forgery, and abuse of process. Mr. Vance." He looked over his bench at me, his face showing a rare, slight smile. "Your property rights are affirmed. The lodge is yours." The gavel came down, and the sound resonated like a triumphant cannon shot. The gallery erupted in applause. I just sat there, my hands flat on the table, feeling 7 years of weight lift off my shoulders. Dahlia leaned over, her relief clear. "It's over, Caleb. You won." Marcia Winslow's face was chalk white as her lawyers silently gathered their briefcases. She never once looked at me as they shuffled her out of the courtroom, where a crush of cameras and reporters immediately descended. The following months were a whirlwind of vindication. The district attorney filed criminal charges against Marcia Winslow: fraud, forgery, theft by deception. The Conservancy's insurance carrier settled the civil suit quickly for a substantial sum, which I used to pay Dahlia, shore up my savings, and start a small legal defense fund for other victims. The HOA members, finally seeing the truth, voted to dissolve the corrupt organization entirely. The ripple effect went all the way to the state capitol. A state representative introduced a new bill, quickly dubbed the Vance Act, requiring mandatory third-party verification for all HOA boundary claims and mandatory disclosure of any conflicts of interest between board members and developers. 6 months later, the fight was officially over, but I needed a final, quiet act of closure. I called Vern, and we spent a weekend in his workshop cutting, sanding, and carving a sign out of a slab of thick, beautiful ponderosa pine. We mounted it on 2 posts at the top of my driveway, right where Marcia Winslow's black SUV had first pulled up. The sign was simple. It read, "Alara's Lodge. Built by hand, defended by law. EST 2017. Liberated 2025. You don't get freedom, you guard it." I stood on the balcony that night, coffee mug in hand, watching the last light fade across the Shadow Peak Range, just as Alara and I had always dreamed. The lodge, it wasn't just wood and stone anymore. It was a monument to a promise kept, and a beacon that proved you can stand up to organized power and win, as long as you have the truth and the guts to prove it. It cost me 2 months of my sanity and 7 years of my life, but I wouldn't trade that fight for anything, because it taught me the difference between a place you build and a place you truly defend. But here's the thing I want to know from you. Now that the system is trying to fix itself with new laws, do you think new regulations are enough to stop people like Marshall Winslow? Or do you believe corruption will always find a loophole? And what would you have done if you only had 14 days left? Drop a comment below. Tell me your thoughts on what true community oversight should look like. Hit that like button if you think the Vance Act is necessary. And subscribe so we can keep sharing these stories of fighting back. I'll be reading every comment, ready to talk about it.